best in radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
And welcome. You are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz, and happy post-election day. And it's particularly timely that we have our next person on with us because he's recently written a follow-up article, Is Barack Obama the Worst President in American History? You're probably familiar with him, Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Peace and Liberty, author, numerous books out there. Ivan, welcome back.
Thanks for having me on, Kerry.
As always. So I think the story about why you wrote this article is almost as interesting as the article itself. Tell us your incident there at Fox News.
Well, I was on Fox and Friends. I guess it was last week or maybe the end of the previous week, and to promote the book. And of course, we were talking about the fact that Obama, his term isn't complete. And I said, well, I have an asterisk saying that the term isn't complete, but he is one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. And I said he was dropping like a rock with this ineffectual ISIS intervention. And so Donald Trump was on the show after me, and he said that my book had zero credibility because I didn't rate Obama as the worst president in U.S. history. And the anchor, who I wasn't on the show at the time, the anchor came to my defense and he said, well, he did say that he was dropping like a rock. But we did discuss the worst presidents in my book, and I explained why I thought that they were the worst presidents. They all started wars, some of which led to big government. And of course, my worst president in the book was Woodrow Wilson, and he really ruined the entire 20th century, and he's now working on the 21st. Many of the problems that we're seeing, including ISIS, derive from the fact that the boundaries were drawn by colonial powers, that the United States helped expand their empires after World War I. So Woodrow Wilson is indirectly, at least, had a role in that.
Hey, and such a great point that you pick Woodrow Wilson, because before Wilson, the U.S. didn't even really have a standing army. The reason the U.S. entered World War I so late in the game, as it were, late 1917, early 1918, was because the U.S. had to field an army, train it, equip it, and then ship it over to Europe. And, it just had no experience with this. And that's what kept the United States out of so many altercations up until World War I. And, during World War I, so many people haven't read the history. We had the U.S. the government seized the railroads, seized numerous industries, all in an effort to facilitate the government's war effort. We had false flag attacks like the Lusitania. There was so much mayhem that went on to get to the run-up to get the U.S. into World War I. And then we wound up with, an army. Granted, it pulled back a lot after World War I, but no doubt it led to World War II. And like you said, directly traceable to where we're at now in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think your point is excellent, that Woodrow Wilson is really responsible for planting the seeds for permanent big government in the United States. A lot of conservatives and libertarians pin it on FDR, and he certainly had a great role in expanding the government. But the real blueprint, which he followed, he was an assistant secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson, and he essentially, when the Great Depression started, he followed the World War I command-style model of how you would run an economy to combat a domestic crisis, the Great Depression. So we saw a lot of the same agencies brought back and renamed, and we even saw a lot of the people who managed those agencies from World War I came back during the Depression. So you had the agencies and the people essentially coming back during the Great Depression, during peacetime, which had been started during wartime. And a lot of the, tax regimes that we've had in U.S. history and the big government programs actually stem from war. And I think that's a main point, not just national security programs, but domestic programs. For example, the income tax started during the Civil War. It was revived in the late 1800s, declared unconstitutional. They passed an amendment. It kept coming back like, a vampire or whatever. And shortly before World War I, they passed a constitutional amendment. But during World War I, the income tax really expanded and was the primary form of taxation in the U.S. for the first time. Previously, it had been excise taxes and tariffs, but now we had this income tax. And then, of course, during World War II, it went from the class tax on the rich to the mass tax. And so then everybody had to pay income tax. So you can see the income tax is a classic example where things keep coming back and they also keep getting worse over time, and they generate in war. Social Security is another one that started in wartime pensions and spread to a safety net for older people.
Yeah, and I remember Mark Twain writing about the bonus marchers from the Civil War marching on Washington to get their pensions then, and he was vehemently opposed to it. He felt it was the beginning of the downfall of the country, giving in to them, because eventually the government caved into the veterans, because how could you not give the veterans?
Big scandal. And at the Civil War, they just kept expanding these government benefits. They keep expanding the number of people that are benefiting from them. And there was it was really the first huge welfare program in the late 1800s. It just kept getting bigger, even as the veterans died off. The program kept getting bigger, and it was a big scandal. And it sort of delayed the onset of the U.S. welfare state because of that scandal. But of course, World War I happened, and then we got that welfare state coming out of World War I. I think even mainstream historians believe that World War I was the single most important event of the 20th century because it really caused World War II, the Cold War, and everything that followed.
Yeah, so I agree with you there. He was definitely the worst. And who's next after him?
The second worst was Harry Truman. Now, he's admired by a lot of people, but he really he took a local conflict in Greece and made it into a worldwide containment program and really helped start the Cold War. Of course, the Soviets also had a role in that as well, but he also didn't declare war during the Korean War, which set a really bad precedent because all our major wars had been declared by Congress. Originally, the founders were concerned about a leader taking the country to war without the people's consent, as the European monarchs did at the time. And of course, the common person had to play in blood and treasure. And so they didn't want that to happen. I mean, there's you can argue the gray areas of the Constitution, but that was not one of them. The declaration of war on the part of the people's houses of Congress was what the founders had intended and still in the Constitution. Well, after Harry Truman, we haven't followed that. And that's a major power of the Congress that has moved to the executive branch. And we see it working right now on ISIS. This war has not been approved. And the Congresses, people of both parties were too chicken to vote on it before the election. Now, there may be a vote now in the lame duck Congress, but that does little good because the president's already committed the troops, and the Congress is always leery about cutting funds for it once the troops are engaged. So, but the president runs these wars now without asking Congress and a lot of the time. So Harry Truman had a really bad precedent there. He also set up the national security state, and he also tried to be commander-in-chief of the nation instead of just the armed forces. He expanded, or at least he tried to expand the commander-in-chief role. He tried to nationalize the steel companies during the Korean War to provide steel to make weapons. And the Supreme Court told him, no. But of course, that has continued this idea that we're going to expand the role of commander-in-chief. Originally, the founders had intended to be a narrow battlefield command type situation. If you have a doubt about that, you can go back to the Adams administration, which was the second administration after Washington, and there were court cases over this very thing. And it was very clear that what the founders of the Republic had intended. But of course, the president has greatly expanded that. So these are the types of things that Harry Truman did. Harry Truman was a very precedent-setting chief executive.
Yeah, now, a couple of interesting things that I find, and obviously you want to find out more about this and get an insight into how Ivan rates the presidents, you should take a look at his book, Recarving Rushmore, Ranking the Presidents on Peace, Prosperity, and Liberty. So Warren Harding, okay, you always think of him as having the most corrupt administration, Teapot Dome scandal, and a lot of other things. And yet, you go back, there was a major downturn in the economy, I think in 1920, 1921, threatened to become a major depression. So what does he do? He doesn't start like public works programs, doesn't increase taxes. He cuts taxes, does a major austerity program for the government, and maybe the Federal Reserve was involved in this too by priming the pump. But point is, the economy turned around, no recession, no depression. Within a year, we go into the prosperity of the 1920s, and you say that he's been unfairly regarded by history.
Yeah, I think so. He did have some corrupt officials in his administration, the Teapot Dome, et cetera. But I think, scandals like that are not as serious as constitutional scandals like Watergate. And I would argue the greatest scandal in American history, as far as the Constitution goes, was it wasn't as glamorous as Watergate or as sinister, but the constitutional aspects of it, Iran-Contra, was probably the worst constitutional scandal. But these graft scandals, it's never good when people put the taxpayers' money in their pockets, but I think it's overrated as a drawback to Warren Harding. He did have excellent policies, and I think Coolidge, for the most part, followed those policies of free market and a restrained executive. And I think my book really tries to rate presidents as the founders would have, and that is, small government and a restrained executive, which is what the founders had originally intended. Of course, now we have an imperial presidency and we have big government all the way. So a lot of these presidents haven't really done too well in my ratings, but Harding is one that I think should be more highly regarded. I did rate him down to some extent. He probably would have been the best president in U.S. history if it hadn't been for the Teapot Dome. But I think he came in like around 7th or 8th, somewhere in there. And Coolidge was at number 10. So they were both very good presidents. And what Harding did was in stark contrast to what Hoover and FDR did when the recession hit at the end of the 20s, and that is that they they tried to do all this stuff to stimulate the economy. And it backfired. It turned a mundane recession into the Great Depression. And as for what you said about the money supply actually didn't increase too much during Harding, and it started to creep up in Coolidge, which may have been one of the problems. But so I downgraded Coolidge a little bit for that. But I think it was mainly Hoover and FDR who really aggravated a mundane recession into the Great Depression. But I think Harding and Coolidge, for the most part, were very good presidents, and they're probably the best presidents of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. And now you have a thing about James Polk and William McKinley. You don't regard them too highly?
Yeah, they would be the third and fourth worst presidents. They both started wars which were totally unnecessary. McKinley gave us our first colonial war, and we were really, the Philippines. We got the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba out of it, and of course, Cuba was a nominally independent country, but it really wasn't. We were running it. And of course, we were really running the Philippines and Puerto Rico. And so, but this, this was really the first large-scale intervention overseas that we had in colonial terms and coming out as an interventionist power. And it really set the precedent for Woodrow Wilson's interventions in Mexico and in World War I and that sort of thing. So I think, it's sort of our coming out party on the world stage. And there were a lot of people who didn't want the colonialism because of our own we broke away from colonialism and during the Revolutionary War. Mm-hmm. So we were sort of a victim of it. And many people in this country didn't want to go down that path, but William McKinley took us down that path. And it was a very small war, the Spanish-American War, but it really had a big effect on our foreign policy at the time. As for James Polk, he basically provoked war with a weaker country to grab a third of Mexico. And it's nice, I guess it's nice to have that land, but it certainly wasn't, we would call it aggression nowadays, just land grabbing. And also it increased the sectional divides, which led to the Civil War. So Polk is the fourth worst president.
Interesting. And and we don't really need to talk about the current occupant and the most recent ones, because I think everyone is familiar with them. But going back to some of the better presidents, of historic times, who else would you rate highly?
Well, my top four are very obscure presidents, and the reason that they're obscure is because they stuck with the original founders' vision of staying within the Constitution. And those are John Tyler, Grover Cleveland, Martin Van Buren, and Rutherford B. Hayes. There were also some of them, they were fiscally conservative, small government guys. Excuse me. And, some of the biases that historians have are, charisma, of course, activism of presidents, and were you president during a war? Well, a lot of times the presidents had actions that led to the war, and so maybe we shouldn't be congratulating them too much, right?
Right.
But in the case of these presidents, a lot of them avoided war. In fact, Martin Van Buren had only a 4-year term, and he avoided 4 wars. The main reason I rated Tyler number 1 was he made an extreme sacrifice for his beliefs in small government, because his party, the Whigs, were a big government party. They were the precursors to the modern day Republican Party. But he didn't believe in what they were doing, because he joined the party simply because he was anti-Andrew Jackson. And so they had this big government agenda, which was not going to be enacted until the Civil War under Lincoln. But he went against his party, and they started impeachment proceedings against him. And of course, needless to say, he didn't serve 2 terms. And in fact, most of these guys didn't serve. My top 5, the only one who served 2 terms was Grover Cleveland, and he's the only president who was defeated. And then he got reelected after that. They brought him back. But he was also sort of a 1-term president for a while.
Yeah, and he really was a tight fiscal conservative who really had real beliefs about the proper role and scope of government, and he would really fight for those beliefs against Congress, because Congress, from its founding, has always wanted to give people stuff, right? I mean, they've really seen that as their role of really rewarding their friends and, if not punishing their enemies, just kind of ignoring them. And, it used to be the president was a kind of a natural counterbalance to them, but that hasn't been the case for quite some time.
No, Grover Cleveland, he was even too restrained as a chief executive sometimes, because he didn't feel it was the president's role to propose legislation, even though the it's mentioned that the president can do that. Now, the Congress doesn't have to, approve it, or pass it. But so there was some legislation that would have been nice to have on the gold standard, et cetera, or really anti-silver laws that he refused to propose because he felt that it wasn't the chief of executive. So in certain cases, he was actually, too restrained. But you have to give him credit because you would never find a president nowadays that acts with any restraint at all. They just do pretty much whatever they want.
Yeah, and it's all within the modern job description of president. And yeah, there's no limitations on the president's power, regardless of what it might say in the Constitution. And you probably remember, Ivan, a few years ago, a reporter asked Nancy Pelosi what was the constitutional basis for passing Obamacare. And she looked at him like he had parachuted in from another planet. Like, what do you mean?
Right. Well, if you look at much of what the federal government does, it's unconstitutional. Like, for instance, the FBI I don't even think it has a legal charter, let alone be constitutional. There's no federal law enforcement role mentioned. And of course, we have the 10th Amendment, which some people like Bork and Scalia are a little bit soft on the 10th Amendment. They think that if it's not said that the government can do it, but the 10th Amendment says quite the opposite, that if only the federal government can only do the powers which are listed in this document, they're enumerated. All others fall to the states and to the people. If you follow the 10th Amendment strictly, most of the federal government is probably unconstitutional. And what it's doing is unconstitutional.
Well, you might have ground for the Coast Guard and customs and Secret Service,
but certainly in healthcare, in law enforcement, et cetera. Yes, we do have a role for the armed forces, although the Constitution does say raise armies, not and maintain a navy. We certainly have the right to a standing navy, but you can say, well, they raise the army every 2 years with the appropriations, or every year with the appropriations, I guess. But but I'll give them that, the armed forces and that sort of thing. The Congress can clearly impose tariffs. I don't think personally tariffs are a good idea, but the Congress has a right to do that. There are things in the Constitution that the federal government has a right to do, but there's a lot out there being done by the federal government that's not kosher.
Yeah, nowhere does it say Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. I mean, you name it. 3/4 of what it does are certainly outside the scope of the original document. Anyway, we have to go, but just tell us again where we find you, where we find your writing, Ivan.
Yeah, my book is called Recarving Rushmore, Ranking the Presidents on Peace, Prosperity, and Liberty. The new edition is just out with Obama in it. You can get it at Amazon, or you can order it from the Independent Institute, and that website is www.independent.org.
All right, and you'll find the link to that site, as always, in the show notes to this interview on financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Don't forget, sign up for the newsletter. Ivan, we'll talk with you again soon.
Thanks, Kerry. I appreciate it.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.